Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar for today. We thank you for answering to our invitation and actually coming in on time. We're very excited about this discussion. It's a conversation that is actually very timely, and especially for the advocacy sector. And we're happy to have you here today. I would like us to go through our webinar norms before we before we start our webinar, so that we are all on the same page. I will post these instructions on the chat box just in case you will not be able to see them, but I'll read them out to you, and after that we can be able to start with the webinar. So first of all, we respect your time and availability in view of the COVID-19 uncertainty. So thank you very much for being here. Please type in your questions and comments in the question and answer box, and we shall attend to them during the question and answers and discussion session. Thirdly, panelists will use their videos and microphones when they're speaking, and all attendees are on mute. If you do wish to ask a question live, please raise your hand and the moderator will unmute your microphone. Please, let's be respectful of each other's opinions. We are very aware and we acknowledge that we are all knowers and keepers of information. My name is Irene Alenga. I am the Knowledge Management and Communities Engagement Lead at the Advocacy Accelerator. For our participants from the French-speaking countries, I'm happy to inform you that we have simultaneous interpretation during this particular webinar. So for use of English language, please you are requested to select your language of choice in the language interpretation tab at the bottom and mute the original language. Please stick to the selected language and only speak in that language during the meeting. Presenters and speakers are also requested to use video only when they're speaking, as I'd said before, and turn on the microphone only when presenting. Otherwise, please mute for everyone to have a good experience during this particular webinar. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to our moderator for today and give the platform to her so that she can be able to guide us through this particular webinar. Thank you very much and welcome. Jean.
Thank you, Irene. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for coming. You're welcome to this conversation on COVID-19 challenges, opportunities, and innovation. We're going to have an invigorating 1.5 hours discussing the challenges to funding for advocacy, opportunities, and innovations that are out there. We have a whole range of speakers that are going to take us through this, including myself, this discussion, plus contributions and discussions from yourself as the audience. So one of the opportunities that this pandemic, I was reflecting that this pandemic has brought to us is the ability to convene very quickly individuals across the continent to discuss issues that are of relevance to social justice across Africa and find solutions. So today we're being convened by Advocacy Accelerator to discuss funding and the practice of advocacy in Africa. With COVID, of course, increasing rapidly across the African continent and challenges that it has brought to the health, economic, political, social spheres of our lives, increased repression of human rights, it's important for us to discuss the issue of advocacy. You would think that advocacy is, you would think that it's logical that we'll have increased funding for advocacy since COVID has brought with it deepened and widening inequality, right? Unfortunately not. That's not what the statistics are showing. And we are going to have a research presentation by Claire on the findings around research on funding for advocacy across Africa. What is happening? Has it increased? Has it decreased? Has it not? We also will have other panelists speaking to the issues and experiences of different types of funding of philanthropic institutions. We'll have Jagan, and as they come to speak, I'll introduce them more in detail with their full bios. We'll have Jagan from Open Society Foundation, the Africa Regional Office, and we'll have George from Uhai, located in Nairobi. Jagan is sitting in Johannesburg, Claire in Nairobi, myself in Kampala, and George in Nairobi as well. So is Irina, coordinator. So I think without further ado, I'll ask the first speaker to get ready to present the findings of the research to set the ground and set the context around this discussion. Just for you to know, this discussion is one of 3 or 4 discussions that are being convened by Advocacy Accelerator, discussing philanthropy in Africa and philanthropy for advocacy in Africa. The agenda, as you see on the screen, will have introductions, which we have done, and the housekeeping rules that Irene has taken us through. We'll have presentations and discussions. We'll begin with one from the Deputy Executive Director of Advocacy Accelerator, Claire Matonsi. Claire, if I've bastardized your name, please forgive me in advance. And then I'll speak briefly to our experience as Urgent Action Fund Africa. So I have the privilege of being the moderator and a speaker, so meaning that I'll have a lot of speaking time. Then we'll hear from Jagan Johnson, the Programs Officer of Open Society Foundations in the African Regional Office, and from George Mwai, Program Officer in Uhai. Then we'll open it up to the audience. You sent some questions in writing, which we have and we've clustered together, but then we'll also like to hear from you. So we'll open it up to the audience. You'll ask some questions, the panelists respond, and we put it back depending on that time. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have about 40 to 50 minutes of an engaging discussion. We're not only stopping at discussions. What is planned is action from here. So we will have a number of write-ups emerging from the conversations that are happening, and yes, advocacy actions. So this is an agenda setting space. Feel free, and you're welcome once again. So moving on, I think we're going to go to Claire. Yeah. So Claire is going to share with us a research that the Advocacy Accelerator has commissioned and done among the technical support, among advisors, and among a whole range of other respondents that she'll let us know. But this is the researchers have talked about around that decrease in funding for advocacy within this COVID-19 period, when we would think it's an opportune time for pushing for structural change. This is why we are here. Claire is the Deputy Director of the Advocacy Accelerator. She's an African feminist with extensive experience in women's rights and gender equality in a global context, with direct experience across Asia, Anglophone and Francophone Africa. Throughout her career, she has worked in diverse sectors at national, regional, and global level. In fact, I've had the privilege of meeting her in a different dispensation she was in at global level. She has comprehensive insight and practical exposure across gender in the context of sexual and reproductive health rights, HIV, governance, economic transformation, and all forms of gender-based violence and its linkages to key issues related to gender equality. She's the chairperson of Access Chapter 2, an organization in South Africa, and the vice chair of Akina Mama wa Africa, based in Uganda, but an Africa-wide feminist leadership institution. So let's welcome Claire. Claire, you have the floor. Please talk to us first about Advocacy Accelerator, second about the research that you commissioned to lay the ground for this discussion.
Thank you very much, Jean, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is on the call. As the Accelerator, we're delighted to host these spaces. We are an entity that exists to advance locally driven advocacy in Africa. So we study advocacy practice, we bring advocates, technical assistance providers, and donors together, but ultimately we try to disrupt the advocacy ecosystem, to challenge power, inequalities, and to support advocates to achieve greater impact. And we believe that that is best achieved by advancing locally driven advocacy and disrupting the North-South dimension of our advocacy work. As the Accelerator, we, as I said, study advocacy in Africa, and we look at different components of advocacy, funding being one of them. And we've looked at funding pre-COVID, and we've looked at funding of advocacy now. And we find that it is critically important that we continue to support advocacy practice across the continent in terms of improved funding of advocacy, more equality in the funding of advocacy, but also looking at how we bring about better ways to fund advocacy that grows advocacy practice as opposed to harming advocacy practice. When we looked at this webinar topic, listening to the advocacy community, it was very clear that we needed to look at the disruption of COVID on a sector that already has strained funding. We needed to look at the funding trends. We needed to look at what the future is going to bring for advocacy, because we know that advocacy is deprioritized very quickly in the development space, and really looking at what the future brings. We know from our research that a great deal of funding has already been cut in the advocacy space. So part of our research is to bring this issue to light in a more meaningful way as part of a broader agenda of supporting the civil society space in Africa, which is suffering a lot of strain, but also to start making calls to action so that we get donors and those that support advocacy to behave and understand the challenges and fund in different ways. So we're looking forward to this discussion. It's not about the Accelerator, but rather bringing donors together so we can not only push them, but also understand their intel, their thinking for the future, and to ensure that advocacy remains on the map. So as indicated, and as Jean mentioned, the Accelerator conducted a study across the continent looking specifically at the impact of COVID on funding for advocacy. And as the Accelerator, we're very specific looking at advocacy. So our report complements other reports that have been done by Civicus and EPIC Africa that looked at civil society as a whole. We really honed in to the practice of advocacy and the agenda of change. And in that study, we found and listened and heard from advocates, and the findings are extremely concerning. There is anecdotal evidence, but the survey really allowed us to cement and put forward what we already know. So in our research, advocates told us 65.9% of those we surveyed had to redirect their funding towards COVID activities. 29.5% saw reduced funding, and only 4.6% saw an increase in funding. But overall, the message across Anglophone and Francophone West and Central Africa was that 84.2% of advocates had their funding affected. And this was linked not only to, we know that majority of advocacy funding is project funding and not core funding. And so organizations who focused on advocacy were seeing a lot of closing of advocacy programs, but also the loss of advocacy staff because they were unable to maintain the support of their advocacy agendas. I think it is important to point out that alongside the reduction of funding is also an impact in the practice of advocacy, in that advocates said they had to shift their strategies to focus on COVID, which raises questions on what happens to ongoing human rights advocacy issues. We know that that COVID has exacerbated them. So if you're seeing a shift in funding in this way, what is happening to issues that we have been working on for years? And secondly, that very few advocates were able to make the shift from traditional advocacy, where we could do the face-to-face, to online advocacy, whilst at the same time 72% said that they had not received support to be able to make that shift. We're also very aware as the accelerator that not all advocates are equal. So there are different groups of advocates with different access to resources, and they're funded differently. And access to internet access in Africa is a challenge. And to say work from home or to shift to digital advocacy is very much not just a given because of the inequalities when it comes to internet access and technology. And so we're seeing a disruption of the entire advocacy ecosystem. So when you see our calls to action for donors, it's really looking at how do we continue funding advocacy in Africa, but also how do we do it in different kinds of ways so that we can support the sustainability and durability of advocacy organizations who are as critical now as they were before. We know that as governments start to rebuild a world with COVID in it, we've seen governments operate with impunity, governments use fear to further shrink civil society. And so more than ever, we need our accountability mechanisms and we need civil society voices. So this is not the time to deprioritize advocacy, but rather to advance advocacy. And so in our diving into the results, we also identified an area of how do we support advocates to understand the shift in the space that has happened? And that is not going to happen without investment, without support. So that's an area that we need to look into, but also hearing from advocates that donors are still requiring the same results and measuring in the same way, which is not possible in light of the disruption around COVID. And so as the accelerator, as much as we continue to document and research the advocacy environment, we continue to focus on funding for advocacy. At present, our call is around continued funding for advocacy, particularly flexible and core funding. We know that advocacy is more effective if it is part of organizational effectiveness as opposed to project funding. And so when there is flexibility around advocacy funding, there is greater innovation, greater impact, greater results, greater ownership, because organizations are able to respond contextually to drive their advocacy agendas, as opposed to very rigid, very structured, and in many cases unrealistic goals around advocacy, because we know that it is very uncertain. Second, I've talked about flexible funding for advocacy. Our third call for action is financial support for advocacy capacity strengthening. The mandate of the accelerator is to advance and highlight African best practice around advocacy. We know that advocacy is done well on the continent, although in a development context, technical assistance and advocacy solutions are developed in the West and exported to the continent. We are trying to change that. And part of our agenda is to advance and support advocates to learn from each other by engaging and sharing, by documenting, and also testing different approaches that are context specific and generated from the continent. So we feel very strongly, as I indicated before, we had advocacy organizations, individuals, and networks saying very few had received support on how to take an advocacy agenda from a traditional environment to a digital environment. And for example, how to use evidence in advocacy, digital evidence as opposed to traditional evidence, because we can no longer be in communities in the same way. There is also the issue of how do you continue to amplify community voices in a digital space when majority of communities do not have access to those digital spaces. So how do we ensure that accountability can continue, and how can we continue to leverage policy moments that are continuing and governments are exploiting because civil society is unable to participate in the same way. Lastly, we are also making a call to action around financial support of doing M&E for advocacy in a different way. We can no longer conduct advocacy in the same way. We can no longer measure in the same way. And we are seeing a lot of challenges for advocacy organizations in relation to M&E. And we're hearing a big call that's saying, how do we do this during COVID and in a world where COVID exists? Because what was seen to be evidence before is not on the table in the same way. So the report is available. We will be sharing it and distributing it widely. But for this conversation, it's really to put advocacy front and center and say to donors on the continent and international donors that advocacy remains a priority. It is a sector that is at risk along with civil society, and there is a need for us to make purposeful and meaningful steps to ensure that funding for advocacy continues, particularly as the rebuild kicks off on the continent, but also to support human rights issues that have been exacerbated by COVID that we're seeing are increasingly being defunded. I will stop there, Jean, and hand over to the panel. I am sure majority of the participants are here to hear from donors themselves around the trends, around what they see coming, what has been their response, but also tips to support advocacy organizations to be prepared for the future, but also to support our solidarity to come together as those involved in the change-making agenda on the continent to work together to deal with the difficulties that will be coming with reduced funding in this space. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you, Jean.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for that research indicating that 82% of advocates had funding affected or their activities affected. And yet, as you've pointed out, the human rights challenges caused by COVID, increased surveillance, suppression, violence, and so many other challenges require us to step up advocacy. Colleagues, Jegan, George, you've had her research. She's put out a call to action to donors, funders, and you are both working with donors, with funding institutions. So I will hand over to you to speak to your experiences, what you're seeing, the trends, and your response to that call to action. What has been your experience and what is your response to that call to action? We'll start with Jegan. Irene, if you could put Jegan's slides so I could introduce him like I did Claire. Irene? Hello? Yes. So Jegan Gray Johnson led the anti-corruption cluster of Open Society Foundation's Africa Regional Office. He's a founding member of the multi-sectoral working group against corruption. He led the campaign with the Pan-African Parliament that ushered in the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance in 2012. He was the focal point on an 11-country study aimed at influencing policy reforms on media legislative frameworks. He has overseen several publications, including effectiveness of anti-corruption commissions, effectiveness of election management bodies, reviews of the African peer mechanism, and so many others. He's currently part of the Africa Regional Office advocacy team of the Open Society Foundation. Over to you, Jegan, for your insights.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Can you hear me? And can you see me? Oh, perfect. Yeah, I mean, no, thanks. Yeah. Excellent. No, thanks for the opportunity. And again, you know, as I said, certainly in response to basically the curtain opener or the curtain raiser, maybe what I'll do is I'll just basically, obviously, go through some of the, you know, 3 phases of our understanding and our experience as far as advocacy is concerned, obviously within the confines of the first presentation. And then secondly, again, to more, responding more pertinently to your questions as to what we see as the next steps forward. I mean, I think that certainly it goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic certainly took us all by surprise. To say the least. Most, myself included, never envisaged that we would spend more than a few months ensconced within the confines of isolation, let alone going through, further to reconfigure how we live, how we work, interact with our internal teams, grantees, collaborators, and also, you know, priority issues, and obviously advocacy targets. I think it also goes without saying that this year, 2020, that for many of us, that the work on broader governance, human rights, rule of law, transparency, and the broader AU continental policy areas that we interact in, that kept a close attention to the challenges on the horizon, was going to be, you know, obviously something very daunting this year. It was going to be a challenge. Obviously, COVID-19, the pandemic clearly excavated that and made that challenge, doubly more, more difficult for us to face. I think certainly, I think from my experience, I think firstly, we need to understand how we work within the limited confines of little or no physical interaction. Because after all, I think, let's face it, advocacy is premised on interpersonal communication, dialogue, and in many aspects, diplomacy. Some would argue otherwise, aimed at really, utilizing our skills through evidence-based and approaches and the face-to-face presentations, therefore making the case for change and ultimately influencing that change through policy-making processes and personalities responsible for decision-making around such proposed changes. I mean, oftentimes, certainly from my experience and the line of work, it's also mainly through the regional economic communities at the regional level and the AU's, many structures that we tend to also basically interact with quite intensively. And clearly, all these entities were also handicapped by the pandemic and were, for the most part, also trying to figure out how they can be effective at the best of times. And with COVID-19, that challenge was even further excavated by the confusion of having to find new methods of responding to a health crisis that no one was fully prepared for, plus the ongoing challenges that the African continent and the respective regional economic communities were facing. I think secondly, we also had to internalize what the pandemic meant for our work and our priorities in terms of both programming, partnerships, priorities, operations, and yes, obviously resource mobilization in terms of funding and grant making. Thirdly, I think we had to adopt or adapt whilst anticipating. And I think certainly for the first 3 months, 90 to 100 days, I think it was extremely difficult and taxing, I think, for all of us. And my experience was clearly, and from a personal perspective, and I'd like to bring certain, personal experiences into these things, because I think it's important. I mean, certainly my experience was one of uncertainty, apprehension, I think a degree of frustration as we were having to unlearn, to relearn, and to embrace a new way of doing our work, knowing that the impact would not be nearly as effective as in the past, or at least as quick and as visible. But we had to engage nevertheless. The fact that there were pressing issues, for example, on elections that impacted on investments made at national level, so preliminary investments before the COVID in preparations for these elections, and also the anticipated reforms in critical countries that were undergoing a change through the ballot box, again, made the situation again, even more complex. The other challenge that compounded this very situation was the fact that civil society organizations, who are our primary partners, were facing the pressures of assaults by rapacious regimes. So, for example, in Tanzania, where the systematic closing of civic space has been vigorously applied several years, actually, before the pandemic hit, and ultimately before the just ended elections. And pretty much the entire East African region, as an example, having faced an avalanche of regulatory assault on non-state actors, mainly through squeezing funding internally or prohibiting external donor support. Now, this was also experienced in other regional communities, but at a far less profound way, and maybe far more subtle. I think also the current environment, or then at the time, where we operated, where funding, as your report accurately stated, was dwindling also at an alarming rate. So we found ourselves at the stage in the game where international philanthropic organizations and IGOs were already deliberately taking an adaptation and mitigation approach to constraints in the civic space and funding, and also the assault around there. And added to this, I'd just like to quote, maybe you've referred to this and seen it, the Open Global Rights Report that found several years prior, before the COVID-19 pandemic, that only a small number of philanthropic developmental organizations engaged in advocacy to challenge shrinking spaces. Most did not. Instead, the new normal was simply to reconfigure grant programs to ensure that they do not fall afoul of new national laws. Others obviously change organizational structures or reduce the scope of their work, or they basically limited their partnerships and maintained a distance, for example, between the more outspoken spectrum of development and human rights activists. So I think clearly, the changes were foisted upon non-state actors and CSOs in a way that they operated as per advocacy choices that they made, and the safe bets based on survival, operational maneuverability, which took precedence over the pertinent and needful issues. So the cycle of the dwindling funding, which is the case that I'm trying to present, is, before the pandemic, was already taking root in many theaters of operation. And obviously, we were at the forefront of that as advocacy, and also obviously through the whole process moving forward. So clearly the issues at hand were already, as I said, daunting. And there was need, once we internalized the problems during COVID-19, to commit to rethinking our work and our approach. Certainly, I think we also needed to reprioritize where we pitched our work, and sometimes with whom. I think the trick was to ensure that those that had committed, that we had at least committed to support, and the things we committed to support were not abandoned. I think that is very, very clear to state that, as difficult it is to try and make that balancing act. Based on that, I'll talk about the focus as advocates from Afro's perspective now. So you'll see that the COVID-19 pandemic had placed an opportunity on the table. for us to collaborate more closely as a network internally. As you know, OSF is a very broad network, very dynamic. And then secondly, also obviously as an African continental entity. So we pooled resources, both old and new, to prioritize the work we did and may not have done, for example, in the health sector, and also across the board in economic justice, transparency issues, expression, assembly, association, migrants' rights, etc. As old and new issues also came to light from, for example, challenging the lockdowns, emergency laws and regulations. So these were obviously new frontiers that we were looking at, not necessarily new, but I mean, couched in a very different situation. Again, the commitment to work around advocacy as a collective, I think, was also something that proved successful. As we dispatched new funding in a very short period of time. I mean, we moved something like $15 million US in a period of 90 days, starting from the identification, prioritization, conception, coordination, consultation, negotiation, allocation, and ultimately the disbursement. This was more than twice the speed at which we could have typically done this. So obviously, as advocates, I mean, we played an overarching role, as our work and mandate is seen as cross-cutting and a tool that touches around very many different thematics. But again, looking from the inside out, going forward, I think it is obvious that COVID-19 response, and as we struggle and try and understand it, will be with us for a while. Donors will increasingly, I think, rely on pooled funding for delivering results on challenging developmental situations. So, for example, I mean, as reported, the Global Fund, the largest multilateral funder around the health systems, provided almost $1 billion to help countries fight COVID-19 and prevent the fragile health systems from being overwhelmed as we had anticipated. I mean, again, this clearly requires speed, quick decision-making, negotiations of agreements, etc. And you'll see that in this process, there's also a new normal, because many of these hurdles around compliance, around monitoring would have been set aside, which means that the levels of security also needed to be tweaked to keep up with the supplying of resources. Again, this represents some kind of a shift. I'd say it's a major shift in the landscape as to how relations around tackling issues of whatever kind. And there's a new thinking around that. Clearly, I think also funders or donors had to face a trade-off between delivering resources very quickly and efficiently, whilst at the same time maintaining and minimizing corruption risks because of the possible loopholes, etc. I think clearly for advocates and in the work of advocacy here, there's an opportunity for transparency and continued demand for accountability to push for a factoring in of monitoring of funds being dispersed by donors to respective governments. So clearly, I think in my thinking, my analysis certainly is that the work in the transparency field will continue to be in demand. And I think obviously advocacy is going to be central to that kind of work, doesn't matter which sector it's going to come from. I think there's also an opportunity for investments to be made in advocating, for example, for the use of technology to capitalize on the virtual world that has been the major source of communication and getting things done. Younger demographics, new ideas, innovations, etc., have been unleashed in the world we operate in. And there's obviously an opportunity to extract new monies and resources to sustain this, broaden the access and the knowledge in our continuity in operating in this environment as an additional avenue in furthering the work that we do. But I think it also goes without saying that many civil society organizations and non-state actors, and it's just sad to say this, that will fold, just like any other sectors in our ecosystem, sadly. But again, I mean, the obvious upside to that is that new ones will emerge. There'll be new configurations, there'll be new synergies and approaches going forward. I mean, clearly, I think we all know this, that CSOs in Africa are already underfunded. Most average an annual budget of under $100,000, and that was before the COVID. So clearly, the pandemic's impact on civil society organizations, and like other sectors, I mean, we're not immune from that, was swift and oftentimes brutal. I mean, I think it impacted on our work for the future, and I think that impact will resonate for a while. Clearly, the issues of the reduced face-to-face community interactions, restricted movements of staff, reduced or cancelled operations, staff working from home, new methods of working, etc. And even in some cases, guys that are involved more directly around advocacy, around the medical field, medications, access, and things like that. Supply chains have been broken and affected. So I think all of these things have had an effect in our work and how we deploy our mandate. So clearly, this is a scary time. But I also like to think that it's also an exciting time. It's time for, I think, new beginnings, which makes it exciting. Though not of our own choosing, but we didn't choose this, but I think we have an opportunity to shape what this new beginning should look like, what it looks like, and what our responses should be. As difficult as it is, there's still very low visibility as we move forward. But I think as a collective, we should be able to chop through those obstacles and those blindfolds that are currently in our way. I think at the end of it all, advocacy will continue to play a role, certainly, for non-state actors in many different fields. But I think, let me say this, we need to collaborate as advocates more effectively than we otherwise might have. We also have to look at pooling our resources. We need to leverage technical and comparative advantages to make resources stretch. In other words, for a lack of a better word, to get a bigger bang for our buck for greater impact. And I think also finally, what we need to do now more than ever before, as we look to recalibrate, for example, our health systems, our governance, normative frameworks, strengthening our institutions, opening up civic spaces and pushing back against autocracy and recidivism we are currently experiencing. And we also need to embrace the youth dividend as a new, young, optimistic, and positively impatient new players enter this domain, bringing with them the culture, as I'd like to call it, the culture of good trouble. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, so much for giving us your experience as OSF, the internal changes. I see a lot of similarities with our own experiences, the external engagements you took on, including disbursing, wow, 90 million in 90 days. Yeah, that's really speedy. But most importantly, for presenting to us as a response to the call to action that Claire put out, the opportunities that are out there, pooled funding, collaborating and pooled funding, opportunities to push for monitoring of funds that donors are giving governments, which are really several $1 million, and if we're not careful, will not benefit individuals, or they'll only go to the political elite. The investment in technology and investment in a vibrant, impatient, energetic youth. The opportunities to push for structural change at this very time, and creativity. So many others he has talked about, but those really stand out around the questions that I see panelists had, what you sent before and what is here, and also the response to the call to action. So we'll move over to George from UHAI. Irene, if you could put George's slide up. Yeah. George is an activist educator who believes in inclusive and intersectional organizing that leads to transformational social justice work. He's part of UHAI Eshari's lead team that focuses on analysis, designing, and facilitating support to increase the capacities of both the sex worker and LGBTI organizations and movements in the East Africa region. George has over the decade worked with sexual and gender minority groups in building their political grounding and long-term social change work. He believes in growing and sustaining community agency, visibility, organizing power, programming, and advocacy for structurally excluded and diverse people across East Africa. He has strong connection with processes that seek to change power equations by tackling injustices and communities that face communities that are marginalized and are excluded in the global south. So welcome, George. Looking forward to your experience and also your words of wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean and Advocacy Accelerator team for creating this very vital space for conversation. So I work for UHAI Eshari, which is a activists funder, which is based in East African region. we work with sexual and gender minorities in the 7 countries. It's broader East African region. I would like to speak a lot about our experience during COVID. Like every other funder, and Jigan has spoken about that, it was a bit of a disruption. A lot of things were planned, travel, partnerships that were laid out, and a lot of face-to-face engagement. Of course, that had to be readjusted. A lot of our support has been to various advocacy work, which ensures that sexual and gender minority groups are included in national, regional, and global platforms of decision-making about their sexual and reproductive health rights, and also health access. We've also been supporting partners to do a lot of advocacy on global health financing. And in that case, the amount of money that is determined in their countries and how much is allocated for key populations and other communities that are sexually and gender excluded. We've also supported a lot of lobbying at international levels on on HIV treatment and programming. We've also supported a lot of events to challenge power over that has been affecting sexual and gender minorities. So all that has been running for over 10 years in the kind of work that we've been doing. But came COVID, but the initial ways of our response has been to ensure that we are accommodative of the experiences of our communities. So the first thing that we had to do is because we are participatory grant maker, we had to convene at various levels with our partners to understand the experiences that they were going through and what the crisis meant to them. And from what we got from our partners was that the priority at that moment was emergency response, which included food or other commodities that were required, but also to respond to violence that was increasingly happening to the various communities that we support. You note that there was a lot of militarization of response by all the governments in the region, where a public health crisis was converted to a military response. We as an organization that funds based on what we are guided by our communities, we recommitted ourselves to being flexible. So we had to ensure that we allowed our partners to work within the crisis and the challenges they were facing. So one of the things that we negotiated was about reporting, was about commitments to particular work that they had. So we allowed our partners to make alteration and adjustments and work with us to adjust even the budgets to ensure that they were able to respond to what they were going through. And that's why we relate so much with what Claire was talking about, flexible funding. We actually adjusted our funding models to ensure that we are providing more general support to our partners to ensure that they're able to respond to the various challenges that were cropping up each and every day, each and every month. Of course, we did a lot of philanthropic advocacy. We are funded by other funders, especially from the global north. And we did a lot of negotiation and advocacy to speak about. We actually need to ensure that all money is committed to flexible funding, and that results reporting or a lot of the usual ways of looking at how change happens was recognizing the challenges that we are facing at the moment. So a lot of back-end advocacy was happening to that, and we actually got a lot of resources which were directed to flexible funding at this period of time. So as a participatory grant maker, we have ensured that a lot of our portfolios are now informed by the current realities of our constituencies. And actually our call for applications right now has been shaped a lot by what the communities have determined as important. I would like to speak about a lot now about the next phase of advocacy, which based on the call for action by Claire and Advocacy Accelerator, speaks a lot about a couple of things that we relate with as an institution. Moving forward, of course, advocacy is not going to look the same way it has been. It's not going to be business as usual. But I want to be a bit unpopular here because what we have witnessed is that in the last few months, we've been seeing a lot of adapting to the challenges of engaging to classical or traditional advocacy. A lot of institutions have been adapting to online presence to proceed and advance advocacy because the crisis has disrupted the way we have been pushing for change. Also, funders have been caught in that mess and trying to adjust to how to support advocacy that is not traditional. I think as a matter of wisdom, we should look back and say, what should we learn from this crisis? This is a moment for us to reflect a lot about the pandemic moment and ask very hard questions about what is this crisis revealing to us? One, around power dynamics. We have been doing advocacy in a way that has seen advocacy from one point, targeting visible actors, targeting governments, targeting power holders. So many of us, or many change agents have targeted the only visible power structures that we know. And I think this is a moment for us to ask very hard questions about what new power structures are emerging, or how is power being consolidated. We've seen from this crisis all over the region that there's a lot of consolidation of power, and governments have actually been key players in determining or setting the agenda. All the agenda in response to COVID have been determined by government. And civil society have been running to catch up with what government agenda has been. This is the high point to recenter our organizing or to recenter our advocacy to actually destabilize that framework that's already consolidating. This is a moment where you have to appreciate that the context has shifted a lot, and that the structural systems that have produced the things that we have been fighting or pushing or advocating for have remained constant and actually have become more solid than before. So a lot of our advocacy have to aim to confront those things that are not actually visible. We have to look at all those power structures that are very invisible but very influential and that have shaped the way the world has been looking like, including global health mechanisms and structures that have been shaped by very invisible factors. And also, in addition to that, we have to think about strategy. We have to think about, we have always supported claim holders. We have always, as funders, we have always supported claim holders, and we have always assumed that the engagement of advocacy will challenge the duty bearers, and we assume that the states and governments will uphold the rights of citizens because they have committed to that. But that is not correct. Look at the levels of militarization that has happened over the period of the COVID. Look at how excluded communities have been further excluded from the mainstream responses in COVID. I think this is a moment where COVID has revealed so many things, and it's a high time that everyone who is engaging in advocacy has to challenge that. And of course, we have to know that to combine and to have an intersectional approach to our advocacy, knowing that violence or exclusion or various oppression have all been intersecting. And the people who make decisions or set the agenda or determine who gets what or who does what have actually worked and actually succeeded very well during this moment of COVID. So it's not a matter of adjusting to the current crisis and adopting to another platform of online organizing. It's a matter of going back to the basic and actually changing strategy. One way of doing that is looking at, is our advocacy actually leading to systemic society change? And can our advocacy self-drive itself without or with funding? Because a lot of our advocacy has been dependent on funding. A lot of the funding has a very narrow way of looking at change. And the kind of change that a lot of people who support advocacy has looked at very short-term cosmetic changes, for lack of a better word. But for us as advocates have to look at deeply, how can the work that we are leading, which includes advocacy, be more sustainable? How can it lead to involvement of building more transformational power so that this power can actually run itself, and this power can be able to transform the systems that have continuously excluded or discriminated a lot of our populations. Just about when I'm about to finish, I think this has to be coupled with a deep power analysis, and funders have to come forward and support this kind of long-term, very challenging work. This deep power analysis will produce a lot of strategy, will produce a lot of learning, and will produce a lot of strategies that will move towards positive power. So funders have to be ready and have to be ready to learn from activists on the front, and have to be ready to understand that change is not just short term, but it's change is always long term if we are looking at sustainable change. And then lastly, if funders have to continue supporting advocacy in this current dispensation, we have to ensure that we have flexible funding. And flexible funding is not money that is comes in small bits, in project-based. We have to ensure that the support we are offering is general support to allow activists to be creative, to be able to pursue the long-term goals that are transforming power structures that have continuously excluded them. So in a nutshell, I think I would say that it's not about supporting log frames. It's not about thinking about a long-term sustainable transformation of work that has to be always supported. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. We are running out of time, but we still have some time for discussions from the participants. And thank you also for pushing us to think about business unusual, power analysis, going for influencing those who hold invisible power, as well as going for for flexible funding. Now, our experience as Urgent Action Fund Africa, which is a feminist Pan-African fund using rapid response grant making, is not different significantly from what Jagan and George have spoken about. We had to adjust to the current realities because we are part of the movements that we serve. So in conducting a rapid assessment at the beginning of the pandemic amongst our grantees and consulting with our advisors, we then incorporated adjustments that are different from our usual mandate of strategic funding to address humanitarian needs, but now are located within a hybrid of both of grantees addressing both humanitarian needs as well as strategic advocacy and other activities. We've also learned a lot from this pandemic and the funding for advocacy, because of course we reflected on the fact that humanitarian aid or humanitarian support to what end when the duty bearers, as George has said, those who hold invisible power are continuing to thrive while communities are picking up the responsibilities that they have. So our main speak or response to the call to action is for us to look at advocacy as or influencing as part and parcel of our own programming and not projectize it and not projectize it as a single issue part of programming and embracing a lot of creativity. I'm not going to say too much in the interest of time, and we want to engage with the participants. I can share more as we go along and as we speak. Right now, I'll open it to the participants. Remember, if you'd like to speak, put your hand up so I can see you and ask you to speak. Please be very brief. We have a very short time left for engagement. Say your question, one question. Don't give us a whole lot of background, just ask your question, and then we'll go to the next. We'll take a few questions. Irene will give us a cluster of the questions that are in the chat, and then we'll hand it over to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very engaging discussion. So far, we have a couple of questions that have come through. We have one who has asked, what can now Advocacy Accelerator do to help small CSOs down there in the community to rise up again? We also have another question by Kanali James that states, how do we support advocacy work when it is in conflict with political views of the powers that exist? Someone has shared with us that as a funding agency, it has been very difficult to respond against COVID-19, particularly in the psychosocial support of the people impacted in one way or another by this pandemic. It's not easy to find funding at the moment, and she shares her support. This is Catherine Tunde from Cameroon. Thank you very much. Someone else has also spoken about wisdom wellness counselors to conduct mental health assessment during COVID-19 and support through development of advocacy messages, which were put to put the masks and the soap bottles. So while we've been going through these funding challenges, there's that message of solidarity that we are in this together, and we're looking for solutions together. Another person has asked, is interested in knowing how CSOs have, how CSOs and how the funding was affected during this period, including some mitigation measures they had introduced in order to cope with advocacy and funding changes. This is from Donnelly Mwanchi. And finally, we have a question from Emmanuel Gassa asking about internally displaced populations or people with multiple vulnerabilities, and how we can advance advocacy through this. So with those few questions, I would like to open the floor for our speakers to respond to it. I think first in the issue of supporting advocacy when political views of the power that be are in conflict. I think George had spoken a little bit about it. George?
Just come up again, sorry.
The question is, how do we support advocacy work when it is in conflict with political views of the powers that exist?
Yeah, quite an interesting question. I think it's important to understand that in any advocacy work, if it's transformational, we have to appreciate that every target or every point of where we are directing our advocacy work has an interest in the matter. And it may be called conflicting political views, but I mean, every party has an interest in that matter. As an advocate, you have an interest in the matter. You would like to have transformational change. So I think it's important for us, if we are engaging in advocacy, to appreciate that there will always be conflicts. And one way of navigating these challenges to understand the kind of conflicts and to understand what is the benefit that this partner or this actor whom we are engaging is gaining from this process. So in that level of mapping and understanding what is driving their interest, then we are able to appreciate where they're coming from. So in that level, we are able to direct our strategies in ways that ensure that we either neutralize their conflicting views, or we are able to pull them to our side. So it is always important to appreciate that advocacy or any organizing work has a lot of conflict, and we cannot organize from a very neutral point. We are not neutral as advocates. We are actually challenging how social power. We are challenging who makes the decision, who sets the agenda, who gets what, who does what. So, and always that has a lot of conflict. And if we are able to analyzing from that point, then we are able to see how to derive strategies that are important.
Thank you very much for that answer.
Irene, there are questions that were sent before. And someone was asking around strategies for inclusion. I thought that would be good for George.
All right.
Strategies for inclusion of marginalized communities during humanitarian crisis.
Okay. Yeah, I can come in.
Yeah.
Strategies for inclusion. I think it's and exclusion is varied. I cannot represent about every group that is excluded, but it's important to understand that exclusion is very systemic and very, at some point, with state actors, very deliberate, from either policy or either from practices and such kind of things. So strategies for inclusion, I think it's important to understand that it's not just about numbers or affirmative action to ensure that excluded groups are part of decision-making or part of budgets and such kind of thing. We have to ensure that we get to the root cause of exclusion. When you're dealing with sexual and gender minorities, the root cause of exclusion is very, very systemic. It's in laws, it's in the way the society has been socialized. It's in the ways in which we have adopted ways of engaging with people who are different. So for us as advocates and yearning to have inclusion of communities or groups that have been excluded, we have to go down to the deep dirty work of looking at the root cause of exclusion. So we can't just lobby, we can't not just advocate to have inclusion of excluded communities. We have to get to understand what is actually producing this exclusion and then deal with that.
Thank you so much, George. Jagan, there's a question around opportunities to tap to address the advocacy bottleneck. Do you want to come in here? You had quite a bit around opportunities when you were speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I presume that when you're speaking of advocacy bottlenecks, we are also, I mean, obviously talking about both the shrinking space and the conflict with states, regulators, so to speak, and also with the funding. I assume that's what it would mean. If that is what it is that what it means? If that's what it is, then I can quickly try and answer.
Yes, it does. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think certainly. I mean, we face with the age-old question. That's always been with us, but I think now with the COVID pandemic, as I said earlier in my presentation, it's even now more profound than ever before, whereby we have to strike a balance between obviously competition versus collaboration. I think competition for resources is one thing, and then collaboration to basically try and fill the gaps and to be more strategic as to how we collaborate and basically take things forward. That's one thing that we need to really try and iron out, as difficult as it is. There's also obviously the greater scheme of things, areas where we don't necessarily control. And this is even where the donors and the funders they have a larger degree of control, but they don't necessarily 100% control this dilemma that we have between dwindling resources and shifting resources. And what I mean by that is that they're dwindling resources in some areas, and then growing resources, shifting resources in other areas, largely now in the health sector. So you'll see that by virtue of the fact that a lot of us, certainly in my case, the advocacy work that we do really has to basically deal with governance and the rights-based, mainly within the governance transparency aspects of it, the programming around that and the funding around that, obviously, for all these other reasons that we talked about, coming in conflict with authorities that be shrinking spaces, overbearing executives and regimes, etc., whereby funders also are feeling the pinch, because at the end of the day, if they're giving with one hand, they'd like to basically get something in return with others. And sometimes whatever they want to get is not necessarily from us as the advocates or the non-state actors, it's largely from the state. So we try to balance that. But at the same time, there is a lot of funding that is being shifted, and then obviously the priorities, because of the pandemic, has largely focused around health issues, supply chain, etc. So I think, we need to at least anticipate that this is going to be something for the foreseeable future. How do we try and at least mitigate against that? As I said, we need to focus on things that are within our control. And I think things that we can control that no one can stop us from doing is obviously to communicate with each other a lot more. To ensure that, and for the sake of that communication, we are trying to avoid the duplication of work, the duplication of investments in a very, very demanding field, but then with very little supply of the resources that we have, the time that we have, etc. So I think it's a fine balancing act, and I think certainly the accelerator itself, this kind of platform that you have, I think it's a wonderful platform to be able to at least not only be a conduit or a channel of giving tips and support systems, etc., but more importantly, the information sharing. To share information so that we'll be able to, at the end of the day, show some degree of African solidarity within civil society organizations to basically bond together and come together. Not necessarily only for mitigating against the falling funding that we're seeing, and also the skewed investments that we are obviously seeing, and rightfully so in some instances, more shifting away and towards the health systems and health and primary health care and other things like that work. But more importantly, also for us to also focus on the most challenging aspects that we're seeing on a daily basis, which is excavated by the COVID, which is the issues of governance and human rights and et cetera, and things like that. So I think there is an opportunity for us to continue to do this, but I think the only way that we can succeed is if we do this together. So I'll stop there. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much again. We have Emmanuel Gassa with a question. Please go ahead and ask your question, unmute and ask your question. Emmanuel? All right, Irene has a question that was sent to her that should, oh no, before Irene, Rustika Tembele, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Irene, is it possible to unmute Rustika?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
I was saying, how do you advocate for COVID-19 in a
Sorry, did we lose Rustika?
country where there's no data about COVID, and yet you see a lot of data being given? How can you advocate? Come again? I was saying, can you hear me? Sorry, we have a problem of network.
Please go ahead. You said, how do we advocate for
COVID-19 in a country where we believe it's COVID-free and there's no data given by the government?
All right.
And yet you say that your neighbors are having lots of, cases. So it's tricky. So maybe I would like to get your support to get somebody help me.
All right. Advocacy in a repressive context, including one where data is not, or information is not a right. That's one question. Emmanuel, are you ready to ask your question? All right, Irene, you had a question. Please read it out, and then we'll move over to the panelists for their thoughts.
Thank you very much. Kanali James said that pool funding is a good approach and the way to go. However, how do funders deal with the different competing visions, aspirations of the various actors seeking to coalesce their resources together? Jean and Jagan, maybe you can answer this question.
All right, Irene. Jagan, you go first.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think certainly, look, and I'm very careful because I'm wearing, two hats at least. One is obviously as a funder, But then secondly, also on the operations side, I mean, getting our hands dirty and doing a lot of the advocacy work in tandem and in collaboration with some of the funders that we work with, because we often also support on the technical side, whether it's research or whether it's just strategic advocacy at the upstream level. But I think certainly one of the things that donors are in a unique position to do is that because they're so diverse, there's a bird's eye view. So we deal with lots of different sets of advocates, civil society organizations in the different sectors. As broad as one sector could be, we deal with very many different actors that have got different strengths. And I think certainly for us as funders, one of the roles that we could continue, we can start playing or continue to play even now more so than ever before, is to act as a connector. I think, we know our donors we know our grantees very well. We understand areas where they've been struggling in. We understand what their strengths are. So I think, what we could do, and we've done this before. We were doing it before the pandemic, and certainly we're doing more of it now. Looking at least matching. Basically matching up different actors, matching up different comparative advantages, matching up different civil society organizations that have got very, very good strengths in some areas and may have certain weaknesses in others, and basically looking at, again, part of that leveraging. And I think certainly for us, and I think other donors as well, that is something, especially for the African continent, that is something that we can continue to do in a very strategic, in a non-interfering manner, but at the same time, just basically be the go-to person. So if you like to call it basically a listening friend, and also a friend that is a matchmaker, so to speak, and to be able to basically introduce civil society organizations with each other, and basically very quickly and very clearly be able to see what the synergies are to be able to reach a common goal or a common objective moving forward. So I think that is a role that certainly we can play, and we should continue to play even now more than ever before. I think for the first question around data in a repressive environment, I think, obtaining data has been a challenge even before the pandemic. Those of you that are heavily involved in research can tell us that. But I think certainly the challenge, again, with the pandemic is the fact that the capacity and the ability by the state and their partners to be able to, one, do the outreach and get the data around COVID. It has to do with speed, has to do with the efficiency, has to do with the capacity, etc. And they have to do that very quickly. That is one thing. That was one big challenge before. Now what we're having is this deniability. And the deniability, again, I think it varies. There are some countries in the Western world that have got all the capacity and the capabilities to be able to do what they're doing. And I'm referring to the United States. There's a certain level of denial. And obviously there's a conflict between the science and also the politics. I think that's no different, for example, of what we're seeing again in Tanzania as of recently, what we've seen in Burundi, again, whereby you'll see that political expediency actually trumps, people's health and their lives. And in some instances, some people will say it's against lives versus livelihoods, which is not entirely true at all. Because again, you need to be alive to be able to have a livelihood. If you're dead, you don't have a livelihood. So I think, there's that very clear, in my opinion, a desegregation between the two, even though politicians in some instances start to conflate. But I think going down to the nitty-gritty aspects of it, where you've got absolutely rapacious regimes that have decided that it's part of their DNA and within their policy to try and suppress information because they see it as a bad reflection on their capacities, on their capabilities, on their health systems. And as a result, it reflects badly on the leadership of that country. I think that's a very difficult situation. But I think at the end of the day, what needs to happen and what could happen, and I think what should happen, continue happening, is the fact that there has to be, again, this kind of, even if it's informal, relationship that is being built with the frontline workers, and to be able to at least give them the support that they need through the data that they're bringing in, because obviously if they are burying people sadly on a daily basis, they're basically keeping a log on that. Secondly, also I think we can still carry on in some instances, not only focusing on the data, but looking at the preventative measures. I think it's important for us to continue to spread the word and amplify issues around public safety, issues around the guidelines and things like this, because I think you can fight government in very many different ways. One of them obviously is not ignoring them, but you can go around them. And I think one of the things that certainly some of us that are in advocacy in the health sector, I think we can still continue to play that role of amplifying the safety measures, the safety standards, and also where possible to be able to continue with our outreach work. I think that is important. No matter how rapacious a government is, I don't think anybody can tell you to keep quiet whilst you are still advocating for issues around hand washing and etc., wearing of masks, etc. That's one. I know it sounds mundane, but I think the information and the education goes a long way in saving lives. I think the second thing, obviously, then we've got some of the more perennial issues whereby access and public service delivery towards very, very basic things like hygiene, water, sanitation, etc., is problematic in a lot of these countries. What do we do to advocate to do something to basically bring this on stream? We don't necessarily need to work with governments all the time. I think we've done it in the past, many, many years ago. We continue to do it. CBO, community-based organizations, I think obviously, again, need to be looked at. I think in some instances, I don't have the data, but I think they are at least being left behind. They're not being taken along as much as possible, because a lot of the multilateral funding now have decided that they're going directly to basically deal with governments, with the state, because they're the ones that are basically dictating and taking command of the COVID response at the national level. But we've also seen other countries, for example, like Gambia. It's a small country, largely insignificant in some instances where I'm from, where there's been tremendous advocacy and pressure on the government to a point where the donors themselves have decided that they're going to circumvent dealing directly with the government in some instances when it comes to public health and dealing with the Red Cross. And so, there are strategies that we could do, as overwhelming and as frustrating as it is. But I think at this point in time, the nice thing about autocrats is that they always give us an option and an alternative to think out of the box and to be creative. And I think this is an opportunity for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Jagan. I'll pick up from where there is repression, there is always resistance in some way, and we just need to get creative about it. Especially, I feel like solidarity is one strategy that's very important. Cross-issue solidarity, cross-movement solidarity, cross-country, cross-border solidarity in circumventing some of these autocrats. Of course, most of us come from countries with that kind of rule, and they've always been strategies. I will not go into so much detail that Jagan has put forward, but that's what the point I wanted to make. Where there is repression, there will always be resistance, pushback, and we just have to find creative strategies. To the question of pool funding, yes, we have competing visions. However, I always feel like we are 55 countries, the need is big, there's room for all players. We are diverse, we have diverse strength. It's a matter of capitalizing on our different comparative advantages as strength for the pool, not our similarities as competition for the pool. So what we are doing as Urgent Action Fund Africa in our new strategy going forward, we're expanding our linking and learning work. So as we work in solidarity with movements, African women, human rights defenders, feminist activists, we are not only providing financial support, we are providing accompaniment, technical and political support, as well as linking them to other partners. So we are a rapid response funder. We could link you to OSF, who knows, or to HI or to someone else. So that is how we are looking at engaging with pools or people that are coming for funding. We are running out of time, so I will start winding down the discussion. I'll ask George Jegan, for 1 minute last parting shots. I'll give my parting shots and then I'll hand it over to Claire, because Advocacy Accelerator is the convener of these conversations, to then close us with what next. George, very short, 1 minute.
Thanks so much, Jean. I think my parting shot will be the pandemic moment is an opportunity for us, like most of us have seen. I think this is a challenge for us also to start rethinking about organizing. I know there are questions around, can we achieve what we wanted to achieve through advocacy? I think this is the high time we do a lot of hard work and investing in long-term organizing and actually movement building. Advocacy can add on, but a lot of critical consciousness and a lot of disruption of norms of how we've been doing advocacy and the things that have continuously led to the injustices that we're facing. This is what is important right now. I think a lot of, let's look at the iceberg and what is under there. And that's where perhaps we need to redirect our efforts during this moment that the pandemic is helping us to learn and unveil.
Thank you, George. Jegan.
Well, nothing much to add. I mean, I think, we pretty much covered all the bases. But just to say that I think we need to, three things quickly. Number one, I think we need to realize and internalize the fact that it cannot be business as usual in this post-COVID moment, certainly for Africa. It wasn't going to be business as usual anyway as we move forward for various reasons that we talked about earlier. There have been many, many shifts in the global world order. There's been very many shifts in ODA funding. There's been also very many shifts in the way our governments have been behaving for the most part. And so as a result, we've always been on the back foot. But I think certainly COVID-19 has basically put extra pressure on everybody. But I think at the same time, extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. And I think this is a moment, I think certainly for African civil society organizations led by activists and also the advocacy activists like ourselves to really look at pushing that African solidarity for civil society actors to basically come together and start reimagining how we collaborate, how we reinvent ourselves, how we reprioritize the work that we do, not necessarily around the COVID moment, but I think it has to go way beyond that. We need a continent that needs fixing. And so as a result, the challenges that we are faced with are quite daunting. The only difference is that I think COVID has basically accelerated the need for us to respond to it. So in other words, the demand for response has been accelerated and pushed forward by the COVID pandemic, as we've seen. So I think certainly there are lots of opportunities for us to basically rethink the way we prioritize the work we do, how we do our work, and also how we see each other as comrades in this particular field. I mean, competition is healthy, but I think if we are competing, let us compete around the ideas. Let us look at leveraging the resources for limited funding, and let us also not allow the narrative of prioritization to be dictated to from the outside. It is our problems that we have to deal with. It is the agenda as to how we solve those problems that has to emanate from us as Africans, as advocates working on the continent, in the continent with Africans to try and basically at least better the lives of Africans moving forward. So I think there's an opportunity for us to think that way. There's an opportunity for us to try and collectively approach this problem as a unit. And I think also there's an opportunity for us to basically rewrite the next trajectory in this post-COVID-19 phase as we move forward. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jegan. So on my part, I'll just say thank you to all the speakers for your time. Thank you to Advocacy Accelerator for convening us. I feel like we should take the opportunity that has been provided by COVID for pushing for structural change And that comes with a lot of creative strategies, creative advocacy strategies, solidarity of which is key, but also keep on convening such spaces for us to reflect and discuss and around issues. I know that Advocacy Accelerator is taking it forward. There will be documentation and further engagement on the issues. There are several other conversations coming up. There's one on the 17th November around building resilience in advocacy, exploring philanthropy in Africa as an alternative funding base. And Jagan has just been talking about our own African solutions, which is the whole point of pushing for structural change at this time, when we are facing dwindling funding and funding going to priorities that maybe we are not sure are our own priorities. Then there will be another discussion on 2nd of December 2020 on the future of funding in advocacy. Stay tuned for those. Thank you so much, everyone. We are at time, but we wouldn't close without having Claire, the convener of these conversations, wrap us up and lead us into the next conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jean. We have gone over time, so I will not take much more time. Just to really thank the panelists, but also the participants. This has been an extremely interesting conversation. So many things were said that are still settling and need to settle, but I think important points were made, particularly around the realities of what is coming. So to quote Jagan, many NGOs and CSOs will fold. At the same time, there are many opportunities, and there will be opportunities to continue doing this kind of work. A call from George around inclusivity and appreciating the moment to think differently so we can really push for systemic, long-term and durable change, which I really appreciate. And then of course, Jean speaking to us about being activist-led and how you listen to the voices of those in communities who are the change makers. I am challenged as the accelerator. We are a learning organization. We use all opportunities to continue to grow, to continue to share, to continue to challenge. And this is definitely one of those moments for us. We will be having more conversations like this because we know that funding is so critical to so many, not only from a philosophical and a theoretical perspective, but also from a practical perspective, because funding funds so many livelihoods on the continent. So we'll continue to have these, and we hope that you'll join us again. Thank you to our panelists for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you very much and have a good day.
All right, thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Till the next conversation on the 17th.
17th, Madison. Ataswata later. Nema natapika. Neema alikuwa anafanywa anaenda kufanywa hospitali kipimo. Sasa before hajafanya hicho kipimo, ilibidi anywe solution kana amesema the whole night anatapika na harisha. Kwa hiyo hata hicho kipimo kama kitafanyika. Kwa nini? She's been having this problem, you know, wanataka kufanya corona, sijui hiyo jina. Colonoscopy, whatever it is. Sasa